and welcome back to Crime on the Clark Fork, the true crime podcast where I tell you about big crimes that happen in small places, with each case having occurred in areas with populations of 15,000 or less. My name is Mackenzie Spence, and I'm your host. Welcome back for part 2 of the Shelly Deer case. If you have not listened to part 1, I would highly recommend that you go back and listen to that episode before you get into this one, because there is a lot of context in part 1 that is really important for you to understand part 2 and to understand the background of this case. Just a quick synopsis of part 1 before we get into part 2 here. As a reminder, Shelly is very abusive towards her family, and her husband David is really at her beck and call. She has already killed one person, Kathy. That's where we ended on our last episode. And her nephew, who moved in with her, ran away, moved to Alaska because of the abuse that she was inflicting upon him, as well as her 3 children. So that is a super, super fast synopsis of episode 1. Really, if you have not listened to it yet, please go back, listen to that episode, and then come back here for part 2. I am really excited. This is episode 25 of this podcast, so thank you to everyone that's been here since the beginning, and thank you to everyone that is just starting to listen or is just coming back from 1 or 2 episodes recently. So I'm just gonna quickly jump into this case so we can get going here. The sources for this episode are Wikipedia, Find a Grave, City of Raymond, Oxygen, FindLaw.com, The Historian, Como News, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, The Spokesman Review, Murderpedia, Chinook Observer, All That's Interesting, The Seattle Times, Short Form, If You Tell, The Daily Mail, and The Sun UK. Raymond, Washington, 1988. Population, 2,901. In 1999, a man named Ronald Woodworth moved into the Knotek home. Before long, he was subject to the same torture and abuse that the girls, Shane, and Kathy had all already endured. Ronald was a 57-year-old gay veteran who was experiencing some substance abuse issues, and he was known to have a really sharp mind, and Shelly's daughter Tori had even began to call him Uncle Ron, as the two became rather close during this initial time that he was in the house. And at this time, Nikki and Sammy no longer lived in the household, and really, Tori had been experiencing Shelly's abuse all alone because she was the only one left in the house with her mother. Her father, David, was always away working and would only come home every couple weeks, if not every couple of months. And Nikki, Sammy, Shane were all gone. Kathy, of course, was murdered. So Tori had been taking the brunt of her mother's abuse, which she had not experienced up until this point, because all of that abuse was being pushed onto other people. Again, David had not been home in some time at this point because he would stay near his job site, which was 160 miles away, and he was actually living in his car at this time and surviving from donations that he would pick up from the local food bank. And when he did get his paycheck, he would immediately send it to Shelly. So he also was not seeing any of the money that he was making. Now at first, like Kathy or like Shane, Ronald was treated really well by Shelly. She poured affection onto him. She love-bombed him. But like always, things quickly took a turn for the worst. Because, again, Shelly controlled those living in her home down to the point of when they could go to the bathroom or when they could shower, Ronald quickly resorted to peeing in a bottle during the night, but when Shelly would see that he had peed in a bottle, she would make Ronald drink his own urine. Tori remembers the first time that this actually happened, and she remembers wondering why Ron didn't just pour the bottle out the window in the morning before Shelly could find it, because this is actually something that she had learned to do to hide the evidence. Shelly required that Ron work in her yard in only his underwear and no shoes, regardless of how hot or how cold the day was over in Washington. And she would often call him slurs and tell him that he was an ugly lowlife. And then, again, the slurs, I'm not going to say them on here, but a lot of slurs about him being a gay man were used against him by Shelly. But even through all of this physical and emotional abuse, Ron would apologize to Shelly when she would get upset with him, and he never stopped calling her Shelly dear. It would always be, yes, Shelly dear, I'm sorry, Shelly dear, all the way through his abuse. In 2002, Shelly took over the care of an 81-year-old man named James McClintock. James was a Pearl Harbor veteran who could often be seen riding his motorized wheelchair to the grocery store in Raymond, Washington, and everyone in the town affectionately called him Mac and really made sure to look out for him. His wife, Mary, needed to be in a nursing home, which left him alone in his house with his dog, Sassy, and he had more than one stroke, as well as some other heart problems after he had put his wife into a nursing home. So around 2002, he was looking for someone to be his caregiver and just help him out in his home. It is believed that at some point around 2000 or 2001, he had gone to the local social services agency, which is where he met Shelly. Shelly worked at the Olympic Area Agency on Aging in Aberdeen, Washington, from April 2000 to June 2001, so just over a year. This nonprofit organization exists to serve vulnerable adults and senior citizens with issues such as navigating Medicare, finding in-home care, or other general issues that they may face. And James was actually a client there, and Shelly had helped him when he had come into the office, but unfortunately, James didn't qualify for that in-home care he was looking for in 2002, which is why he eventually hired Shelly for this job. At the Olympic Area Agency on Aging, Shelly was in charge of helping people who called or had come into the office with things like referrals to other support services, or to provide them information that they may be looking for that they couldn't find on their own. She would also visit clients in their home, but this was rather infrequent. It wasn't really a big part of her job. Shelly was actually fired after 14 months working at the nonprofit, but the organization didn't come out and say why she was fired, just that it was better for both the organization and better for Shelly if she no longer worked there. Around 2 months after she was let go from the nonprofit, Ron started calling people who still worked there and threatening them by saying things like, Mount Vesuvius would blow, or heads will roll. He also made comments about hell and the devil, and these calls continued for nearly 2 full years. And now, looking back, investigators believe that Shelly was actually requiring Ron to make these calls on her behalf as a form of torture for him, or for him to avoid some other form of physical or emotional torture. After James hired Shelly, he actually changed his will to give his home, his savings, and his very special dog, Sissy, who he loved so, so much, to Shelly. He says that he wanted to give her the money so she would be able to take care of Sissy, who he actually wanted buried next to him when she passed, if he were to pass first. It really didn't take long for neighbors of James to start hearing Shelly yelling at him inside of his home, or they would see Shelly walking next to him while he was riding his motorized wheelchair and just talking to him like he was a child and infantilizing him. She eventually moved Ron into the home with James, but about 6 months after she began being that caretaker for James, he passed away from blunt force trauma to his head. When Shelly called 911, she told the dispatcher that James had fallen from his motorized wheelchair and hit his head, and that he passed away immediately. And apparently Ron was also in the home at the time that James died, and he corroborated her story. But for many, they believe that James was just another victim to Shelly. After James passed, Shelly was given $5,000, and Sissy, again, the money was to take care of Sissy at James' passing. And she was also willed James's home, but she was only awarded his home after Sissy had passed away. So the home was really willed to the dog. Once the dog passed, that's when Shelly could take ownership. Now, strangely, Shelly started telling everyone that Sissy passed not long after James did, and a lot of people were confused because Sissy didn't seem sick. She seemed like a healthy dog. But again, that's how Shelly was able to take over James's home, and it didn't take her long to put that home up for sale. Now, if you didn't guess, Ron was not doing well. He was being physically and emotionally abused by Shelly in the same way that Kathy was. And Shelly would make Ron jump from the roof of her 2-story home onto the gravel of the driveway over and over and over again, which severely wounded his feet. Now, to treat these wounds, Shelly would boil water and bleach and then douse his feet in this concoction. This treatment, in quotation marks, eventually caused Ron's skin to slough off of his feet, and these wounds were what led to Ron's death in 2003. Now, Tori remembers that in the last month of Ron's life, he smelled like bleach and decomposing flesh. She said it smelled as if his skin was burning off of his body. When Ronald passed away, Shelly called David in a panic and said that he needed to return home immediately from his job site. Again, his job site was 160 miles away. It wasn't until 3 days later that David was actually able to get home, and that's when he found out that Ronald had passed away. And the reason that Shelly needed him home was so he could dispose of the body. Shelly told David that Ronald had committed suicide, but she had told the police that he had left on his own accord. So the reason that she didn't call the police about Ronald is because she would look suspicious because she had lied. She had stored his body in the freezer until David was able to return home those 3 days later. And at the time, the area of Raymond, Washington was under a no burn warning. So David knew that he wouldn't be able to cremate Ronald in the fire pit like he had with Kathy the years before. Because if he made a fire, someone would call in the smoke and the police and the firemen would arrive at the home, finding him burning Ronald's body. So David quickly began digging a grave for Ron before shoveling the dirt on his body and covering some of the dirt on top with leaves and other vegetation to make that spot appear undisturbed. And Shelly started to tell people that were close to Ron that he had just moved away, like he told the police, and that he had gotten a new job. She even went as far in this lie to changing his address on his credit card to some random address in Tacoma, Washington. Now, following Ronald's death, Tori, Nikki, and Sammy finally reached their breaking point and called the police on their mother. Tori and Sammy had made a plan with their mom to have Tori stay at Sammy's house for the weekend, but what Shelly didn't know, is that Sammy was actually planning on bringing Tori to Nikki's home. And again, Nikki was the daughter that she disliked the most. Now, Tori had only ever heard bad things about Nikki because, again, her mother did not like her oldest daughter. So at first, Tori was skeptical about going under her mother's nose, but Sammy didn't take no for an answer. It was at Nikki's home in Seattle that Tori heard for the first time about the horrible things that their mother had done to Sammy and Nikki, and also to hear about the things that their mother had done to Shane and Kathy. And again, these things mirrored what Tori had been experiencing at the hand of her mother and what led to the death of Ron. The three sisters called the police together, and when the police arrived to remove Tori from the home, she was just 14 years old. So she is not a teenager. She's barely a teenager. She's definitely not an adult. She is so young to have to go through these experiences that she has so far. And again, when the police arrived and removed Tori from the home, Tori whispered to the police officer that she had actually hidden some of Ron's things in that pole barn on the property as proof that he was living with them recently. She told that officer that they needed to get into the pole barn as soon as they could because she knew that her mother and her father would destroy every piece of evidence that Ron had lived at their home or that Ron had recently been living in their home. Shelly and David Knotek were soon arrested in connection to Ron's disappearance, and they were questioned. Now, David broke down quite quickly once they were questioned and admitted to disposing of Ronald's body, but also admitted to killing Shane. He told investigators that Shane's death was an accident and that the two had actually been fighting over a gun that Shane was not supposed to have based on the rules of the home. And the gun discharged when they were in a struggle for it, and that bullet hit Shane in the neck, killing him. It didn't take long for this story, which was a lie, to dissolve and for the truth to come out. And after being pressed a little bit more by investigators, David finally told the truth. He told them that Shelly had ordered him to shoot Shane because he had found out that Shane had pictures of Kathy just before her death, and those pictures would lead to Shelly and David being in trouble with the law. On top of this fact, David and Shelly had required Shane to assist in burn and dispose of Kathy's body. He stated that he shot Shane with a .22 caliber rifle and then burned his body before dumping his ashes at the beach near the home. He had also attempted to burn the rifle that he had used to kill Shane, but only the stock of the gun burned, and the barrel, which is made of metal, was then stored in the laundry room of the home. Investigators brought David back to his house so he could show them One where he had buried Ron, and also where he had burned Kathy and Shane's bodies back in 1994. He told detectives that Kathy had died because she was ill and choked on her own vomit, and that he had tried to perform CPR, but it was too late by the time that he had found her. He then went on to say that he didn't call the police because when she passed of the injuries that were present on her body, he didn't know how that would have looked to police. And in his own words, he said, and I quote, "I know I should have called 911, but with everything that had been going on, I didn't want the cops there. I didn't want Shell in trouble, or the kids to go through that trauma. I didn't want this to ruin their lives or our family. I just freaked out. I really did. I didn't know what to do." End quote. And I just cannot wrap my head around the fact that he mentioned not wanting to traumatize the children in the house by calling 911 when Kathy died, but he was fine with them being, 1, abused by Shelly, 2, being abused by him because Shelly told him what to do to them, or 3, allowing them to watch Kathy be abused for years and years. And on an even more perplexing note than that, he told police that he did not think that Shelly had abused either Kathy or Ronald, but he did say that the last time that he had seen Ronald, he had many cuts and bruises all over his body, but he wasn't sure how he got them. At the end of his statements to the police, he was taken into custody and booked in jail. Ronald's body was exhumed not long after that, and they also sifted through the dirt in the yard of the family's home for any other human remains or evidence that could tie Shelly and David Knotek to any other crimes. In the home and on the property, they were able to find items that belonged to both Kathy and Ronald, as well as a lot of items that were stained with blood, including a pair of bloody slippers. They also found Sissy, James McClintock's dog, the one that Shelly told everyone had died, and Sissy was alive and well. The funny thing is that when they found that Sissy was alive, this caused James's home, which was still for sale by owner, which again, the owner at this point was Shelly, to be no longer owned by Shelly, and the house was given back to Sissy the dog. Investigators did do an autopsy on Ron's body, and they really could not confirm a cause of death, but he was incredibly malnourished and also covered in bruises and cuts. Shelly was also arrested at this time, but she was under the impression that David had stuck with their rehearsed story about where Ronald was. And this story was that David had driven him to Olympia to catch a bus to San Diego. But unfortunately for Shelly, her husband had already confessed to the multiple crimes that they had committed, and she was also booked in jail. And both David and Shelly's bonds were set to $2 million. When neighbors of the family were questioned, they told police that they never saw anything odd happening at the home, but the home was shielded by tall pine trees. The gate to the home was always closed and adorned with a yellow ribbon, which is often used to symbolize support for soldiers in the military. Their mailbox was even painted with pink hearts and suns with smiling faces. And another neighbor had mentioned that Shelly often seemed like she was stressed and high-strung, but other than that, the family seemed like any other one in the area. Soon after these arrests, investigators requested DNA samples from both David and Shelly, as well as handwriting samples. They believed that correspondence from Kathy and Ronald to their families had been forged by the Knoteks, and they hoped that the DNA samples would help them determine if the couple had administered poisons or other medical compounds to their victims, so they would have been in a more compromised state and easier to control. About 6 months prior to the arrest, David Knotek had been having some health issues, and this is all according to his supervisor. And his supervisor had also noticed that his performance on the job had taken a really large hit over the last 6 months before his arrest. Investigators uncovered other crimes that Shelly had committed during the, look into these murders and over this time. And these other crimes that they found included identity theft. They found that she had used the social security numbers of her victims, as well as up to 7 other numbers that did not belong to her, including James McClintock's. Her daughter Sammy remembers that when she was applying for an apartment, she was being denied because her credit was so bad. Her mother had used her social security number and taken out tens of thousands of dollars in loans and then never paid them back. It also wasn't uncommon for Shelly to take money from her children's bank accounts. And they had also found out that the cancer that Shelly had been battling for quite some time was fake. She would often shave off her eyebrows or cut pieces of her hair off to try and prove that she was sick. And she had even convinced her husband that she had cancer. And David would drive her to her appointments, where Shelly would be all day while he waited in the car. And it's believed that she would go out the back door, go away for a couple of hours, maybe go shopping, come back in that back door, and walk out the front of the building where David would still be waiting for her. In 2004, Shelly entered into an Alford plea, which made it so she did not have to admit her guilt to the crimes, but she was aware that if she were to go to trial, the jury would find her guilty on the charges of manslaughter and second-degree murder for both Kathy and Ronald. An agreement was reached that Shelly would be sent to jail for 17 years, but the judge told the defense attorneys and prosecutors that he needed more time to think this sentencing through. And after 40 days, the judge decided to sentence Shelly to 22 years in prison, which was the highest possible sentence he could give, where she wouldn't have the chance to appeal the conviction or the sentence. The prosecutor stated that Shelly just showed an extreme indifference to human life. 5 months after Shelly was sentenced, David was sentenced for the murder of Shane Watson, who, again, he shot and killed under Shelly's orders. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the murder and was eligible for parole in 2019. Throughout his time incarcerated, David kept in contact with Sammy and Tori, who both forgave him for what he had done and his parts in their mother's crimes. But Nikki was unable to forgive David. In 2016, after serving 13 years of his sentence, he was paroled from prison. And in June of 2022, after hearing that there was a chance that Shelly would be released from prison, David actually filed a protective order against her, so she would not be able to interact with him. On November 8th, 2022, Shelly was released from prison after serving 19 years behind bars, which is just absolutely insane to me. She should be in prison for life, but it's not my choice. And after she was released, it came out that Shelly was controlling and manipulative to her cellmates in prison, which got to the point where she was no longer able to have a cellmate. According to someone who knew her at her time of release, she was in bad health, and they were pretty sure that she wouldn't have the strength to do anything like this again physically. But to me, the kicker is that Shelly didn't use brute force. She had her chokehold on others to be able to torture them physically and mentally, as well as a chokehold on her husband to physically abuse people. Prior to Shelly's release, Sammy told the media that, and I quote, "When my mom comes out from prison, I don't want her to be able to hide it. She's the biggest manipulator of anyone I've ever met. I don't think that she could ever outgrow that. I don't think she could ever change." End quote. I was not able to find any information on where Shelly is now or if she's still alive. I will have a picture on my Instagram that is the most recent photo of Shelly, so you can see if she's in your neighborhood, and I really hope she is not. But that is the end of this second part and final part of this just horrific case. As always, please give me 5 stars on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're into writing reviews, feel free to throw a review on Apple Podcasts as well. I'm always looking for new cases to cover, so if you do have a case suggestion, visit the link in the show's Instagram page, and the Instagram is @crimeontheclarkfork. I post pictures here as well, so if you want to go give that a quick follow, you can see photos from each of the cases, and again, I will be posting the most recent photo of Shelly that I could find on the internet. So, you might want to go take a look. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll catch you next time with more big crime in small places.